That's right, it's time to dive back into Bloodborne with the series that keeps on giving, pitting two legendary warriors against each other in the FromSoftware series, to see who comes out on top. So without further ado, howdy, I'm Prakuza and welcome to DevBox, where today we're asking who can make their way through Bloodborne more successfully, between the noble katana-wielding samurai and the brutal axe-wielding Viking, in the latest edition of Generational Grudgematch. Alright, to start out, we need to prepare our resident samurai, and once again, I can't possibly think of a better name than Musashi, one of the greatest known duelists in Japanese history. However, before we can start using his classic dual-wielding katana style, we need to check the vibes here by fighting the werewolf at the start of the game. Ooh, that's bad vibes. Not looking good for me right now, but that can't really speak on the samurai yet, considering we don't even have a weapon after all. In fact, once we are sent to the Hunter's Dream, we can't use any of the starting 3 weapons either. So as we head back into Yharnam, all we're equipped with is a gun, which, even though we're using flintlock, this is still the most accurate weapon for the samurai at the moment. This extends across many of the most notable eras of samurai history, including both the Muromachi and Edo periods, as many samurai battles during the Muromachi period were decided by the use of guns, especially during the later end of that era during the Sengoku, or Warring States period. But also, during the relatively peaceful Edo era, samurai looking to showcase their wealth and status would hungrily hunt down the most modern and powerful guns they could get their hands on. For one, because having a big modern revolver makes photos of samurai look sick as hell, and would naturally give them an advantage in a fight and all that jazz. But most importantly, however, is the fact that these generally had to be imported during a time of extreme isolationism before the Meiji Restoration. So, having a modern Western revolver meant that the barriers of the country's foreign policies don't limit you as much as it would a peasant in the same period. As for the weapon we'll be actually using to kill stuff, we can pick up the saw spear in the sewers in order to start fighting for real. While I generally prefer the collapsed form of the weapon, the spear does work as a samurai weapon as a representation of the yari, the classical Japanese style of spear, which would come in various shapes and sizes, and is one of many weapons that diverges from the general katana style of blade, and showcases the diversity of weaponry that samurai would take into battle throughout the centuries. A historical samurai arsenal was much more than a handful of variations of the same curved sword. Now for the Viking, we have a new name that's a little less godly and a touch more human. Ragnar. For those of you wondering if I'm a big fan of that Viking show from a few years back, and naming our Viking moving forward after that show's main character, I think. No, I only found out that his name is Ragnar while doing research for this video. Instead, I pulled this name out of the Red Rising series. If you're in the know on that one, then I really don't have to explain, but for those of you who don't, he's easily my second favorite character across all 6 books so far. Not sure if anyone's gonna top the Howling Goblin for my top spot though. But the giant obsidian is still hard to beat on his own. As we start off, Ragnar manages to kill the werewolf and give us some great vibes at the start of the run. So maybe this version of the Viking won't be too bad. Right off the bat, in the Hunter's Dream, we can also pick up a starting weapon. In this case, we get to use the Hunter's Axe. I'd make a comment about this being one of my preferred starting weapons, but honestly, all 3 are pretty killer right at the start. Sure, the Hunter's Axe and Saw Cleaver have better staying power through the rest of the game than the Threaded Cane, but I really can't say that there's a bad choice to be made here at the beginning of Bloodborne. The only problem with the build for now, though, is that we can't use a gun at all. So yeah, no Hunter's Pistols, Blunderbusses, or even my precious Avalon further down the road. That doesn't mean we can't visceral at all, but it will mean a distinct lack of parry and ranged opportunities in the fights where it might help the most. As we start to kick off the actual boss fights, a spear should honestly be viable for Ragnar as well, but we're going a different direction here so that the 2 can actually compete from start to finish. While the spear would be a historically accurate primary weapon for a Viking, having it now would put too much advantage in Musashi's hands if they're competing with the same main weapon but Ragnar can't use a gun. So we're sticking with the more iconic axe for now. Alright, time to get started on fighting some bosses, and that naturally begins with Cleric Beast. The Saw Spear isn't terrible in this fight, especially with the serrated damage, which goes hard against beast-type bosses like this. I'll be honest though, I'm really not into the spear mode of the Saw Spear. It's slow and the range doesn't really feel like it makes up for the lack of actual DPS. The movement is also kinda clunky and hard to work with. So as much as I should be using this as a spear for most of the fight, I find myself constantly using the collapsed form instead. It's certainly the better way to use this weapon, in my hands at least, but if I'm using this as a stand-in for the Yari, the Japanese spear, then I'll need to take into account that it's a better cleaver than a spear. For the Viking, we've got the Hunter's Axe, and we've also picked up a torch to fill out the left hand. That being said, we can use the transformed version of the axe to hold it as a two-handed weapon, and not really have to worry about our lack of a gun. I'll also note that my own personal preference with this weapon, and the fact that it was my go-to for the start of runs in this game for years, I simply know it better than most of whatever else we have access to at this point. That being said, I don't know how well this one goes for raw DPS against a cleaver, and it might come down to time on whether or not this comes out on top, even as it gets a free visceral and blasts the Cleric Beast down in under 2 minutes. Alright, the first score of the match, and this one could ideally go either way. Both fights take about the same amount of time, neither really puts me in much danger of actually dying. I mean, it's Cleric Beast. That was never really going to be in question until we get to Gascoigne, probably. However, I think this one has to go to Ragnar for the Hunter's Axe over the Saw Spear. It really comes down to the fact that the spear form feels much less effective than the cleaver form, and even then, while disregarding the spear form for most of the fight, the Hunter's Axe still manages to come out on top in time. In this case, this is a point to Viking, and I don't really see the spear competing with the axe moving forward. There is some heavy struggle on display in this fight right here, especially in the first phase as I fail to land a charge R2 to set up for a visceral with the music box. Then fail to actually get a visceral after getting a parry with my gun. It's rough, but that's my own execution, not the actual strength of the build. I mean, I could possibly argue that the Charge R2 might have been faster and more useful in the cleaver form, but I definitely could have gotten my timing and positioning a lot better as well. At this point, the music box is honestly the biggest benefit to this fight. Otherwise, the Saw Spear is fine here, and I understand why some folks consider it pretty goated. Still, I'm not a huge fan of trying to use it specifically as a spear. Well, it would appear that even without a gun, Ragnar is the better axe wielder than Gascoigne. Once again, the music box comes in clutch to get some easy back attacks, but because I keep using the axe in the two-handed mode, I can't get a visceral from a charge R2 to the back, since it always launches Gascoigne away from me on the second hit. At least in the first two phases, that is. Still, even as the fight doesn't go as clean as it can, making better use of the various forms of the axe, we kick Gascoigne's teeth all the way in, fangs or no. Honestly, this one is pretty evenly matched. It's between Musashi's ability to deal some minor range damage or land a few parries that I absolutely suck at in the first few phases, and Ragnar's more powerful Hunter's Axe with its superior moveset for this fight. In that case, we're actually going to call this a point for both, though I will admit that this is mostly due to how good guns can be against Gascoigne, rather than the spear actually going toe-to-toe with the Hunter's Axe. Now that we've beaten Gascoigne, our choices of forward momentum spreads out a little bit, but without spending handfuls of blood echoes, our best bet is heading down into Old Yharnam. Here we can also upgrade our weapon by replacing the saw spear with the rifle spear. Now, I'm saying upgrade, but this might legitimately be a major downgrade. Either way, neither are my favorite weapons, especially when used in the spear form specifically. That being said, I've really never tried out the rifle spear before this run, and I was kind of excited to see how the weapon fares when I had started it, which then takes us to the blood-starved beast, who we take out with the pungent blood cocktail in the corner method. Is this really all that relevant to how a samurai would fight, with specifically a wine made from blood used to lure an enemy to take a sneak attack from behind? Maybe there could be some argument about the use of sake and partying outside of an enemy castle in order to draw them out and then attack while they're inebriated or distracted. However, many of those tales are more anecdotal than they are traditional tactics. So yeah, we're fudging a bit to make this extremely annoying fight more manageable. Once again, Ragnar will be skipping the new spear that's available because we're still trying to pit different weapons against each other. Gonna need more spear rep in future games for him, honestly. But Bloodborne's only got the 2, and we still haven't gotten a more legit samurai weapon yet, so this is what we're working with. Oh, and we also get to pick up the shield before we head down into Old Yharnam. It's terrible. In fact, it's not only terrible at defending, but actually actively works to get me killed. Because not only does the shield not really stop any damage from most enemies, getting the shield knocked to the side actually leaves me exposed to a follow-up attack. So we actually take more damage trying to defend than if we straight up ate the attack without trying to reduce that at all. Anyway, back to the pungent blood cocktail method to wipe out the blood-starved beast. It almost goes south. We're going to call this one null, to be honest, since neither of these builds really have the reasoning to have used pungent blood cocktails. But hey, at least we get access to the Cum Dungeon and can now buy infinite blood vials and quicksilver bullets after making it through this boss. We won't be using these souls on levels though. Anyway, points for neither, and we move on with no change to either score. Alright, we get to move on to Vicar Amelia. This can be a real turning point fight, and success here is a pretty distinct DPS check. As for the rifle spear, having upgraded it to +3 already, it does pretty well to keep up the DPS that breaks the boss's limbs fast enough to keep her stuck on the ground for most of the fight. Honestly, a good Vicar Amelia fight almost feels cruel, and the sequence of constantly slapping her shit while she kneels down, gripping broken body parts, feels fucking cruel. Alright, and for the Viking, we finally get a new weapon to replace the Hunter's Axe. In this case, we need to go pick up the Tonitrus in Hyperion Jail. Similar to the giant blacksmith's hammer in DS2, this is our Thor's hammer stand-in, which is going to be a theme moving forward in all of these Samurai vs. Viking matches. This is mostly because at a certain point, diving into mythology could be the key to actually keeping up between the Viking and the Samurai throughout the series, because weapons like Mjolnir and Dripnir are going to be the only way to counter the katanas that appear in most of these games and are ridiculously overpowered every time. This is also a great time to mention how we understand Viking culture in the modern day, and how much of the surviving writing is either accounts from non-Vikings or the Edda. Hell, I mentioned one of the most iconic parts of Viking society being flaming burials at sea back in the last video. However, upon further research, even that is very tentatively attached to actual Viking culture, as it first appears as a retelling from the Britons talking about a ceremony that the viewer witnessed but did not participate in, and merely assumed to have been related to Vikings. Putting stuff together from actual Viking or Norseman history is real messy. So, surviving mythology directly from the Edda, it is. The Edda being a collection of stories from Viking culture written in two pieces as the Prose Edda and Poetic Edda, both of which are the closest we have to actually documenting any part of Viking culture. In this case, primarily mythology, that comes directly from the Vikings themselves. As for Amelia, this goes fine. The Tonitrus is kinda nice, but the damage does feel a little low, especially in comparison to the axe we had for the last few bosses. Although, we do find ourselves needing to swap back to the axe right at the end, since the Tonitrus is so brittle, it actually breaks before getting the last few hits off on Amelia. Now, I could have accounted for this before the fight and fixed the weapon before running in here, but this is honestly the first time I've seen the weapon at risk text in Bloodborne in a long time. And I sometimes forget weapon durability even exists in this game. So if it's going to be a problem now, that doesn't bode well for the Tonitrus. After the fight, we'll also start leveling Arcane for a bit because of how it scales with this weapon, among other things. Honestly, the damage of the Tonitrus isn't so bad that it really deserves to lose this one on those raw stats alone. However, the brittleness of the weapon really starts to change how I need to focus on it from here on out. And the learning moment is, yeah, it's a pretty harsh strike against the weapon. So this is a point to Samurai, more for how brittle the Tonitrus is rather than the actual benefits of the rifle spear. Boy, this is a really by-the-book fight against the Witches of Hemwick, huh? As you can absolutely tell from all this footage I have of the fight. Oh wait, I don't have any footage because the game crashed and I lost the entire fight. Damn. Well, again, it's pretty by the numbers, but I will note that the rifle spear isn't great about most Charge R2-able bosses, mostly because of the way that the two-handed Charge R2 rushes forward and tends to miss the actual target as a result. I'd show you the effect happening here, but again, you know, sometimes being a YouTuber is super fun, and other times you've got to write around shit like this happening. So Ragnar runs into several problems right off the bat, including starting the area with too much insight, so the Mad Ones start attacking me when I first arrive. Guess the Viking is taking his trip into Yharnam a bit worse than Musashi. Then, when we actually get into the fight proper, the Mad Ones that spawn in the boss arena are way more aggressive than I normally see them, and I even need to kill at least one of them. Otherwise, the Tonitrus's speed works really well against the witches, and its Charge R2 is incredible. The attack comes out lightning fast, and if I've buffed it with the L1, then it deals insane damage against most enemies, the witches and their Mad Ones included. Well, I don't have any video proof to show you why this is the case, but I can pretty comfortably say that this one is actually in favor of the Tonitrus. The spear's Charge R2 is so unwieldy and really grinds against the tempo of this fight. So even if RNG hit me a little harder in the second bout, this still is the point for Viking, thanks to the Tonitrus being a pretty solid beater with a fast and simple moveset. So, after taking out the Witches of Hemwick, we decide to go for what I can only consider to be a mistake. Attempting to fight Martyr Logarius way too fucking early. For those of you in the know, then I'm sure you can guess why we came here the second we had access to the Forbidden Forest. But either way, this should probably still have waited, and usually would for any other build that didn't need something that was stuck behind it. Hell, getting through Castle Canehurst alone is abysmal this early on. But we soldier through and start fighting the old bastard. It really doesn't go well for a long time. Especially since he can blast me down with 1 or 2 hits, and my damage means that each attempt is upwards of 5 full minutes, scratching him in the balls until he either dies or nuts, which is what I'm calling it when he hits me with that stupid little no telegraph close range explosion skull attack. Yeah, Logarius is now in the running for my least favorite boss in Bloodborne. Strange how fighting some of these dudes out of order will do that. Anyway, the trick here is to hit him twice and wait for his counter. If you get too aggressive, he'll either poise right through the third attack and slap you back, or whip out that super fast skull explosion that hits faster than any weapon the player can get in the entire fucking game. I'm not having fun, and the spear is really not the GOAT for this fight. Now, while we did need to get here early for Musashi, there's certainly no reason for us to be here this early as Ragnar. But we've got to do the fight now, since this is when Samurai did it. Otherwise, if our builds are too out of sync, then this could really turn one-sided from a competitive viewpoint, and that could really skew the results a bit. That being said, we'd be using the Tonitrus at this point no matter what, so it really doesn't matter since the weapon is really showing its lack of dabblage against Logarius. The only thing I do have on my side is the fact that I've already figured this fight out back in the previous run. It's not enough to make this enjoyable, but at least the learning curve is a bit shorter this time than it was in the last run. Although my own bitching out of the way, the Tonitrus does have one huge advantage that makes this a lot easier for Ragnar. as the charge R2 is fast enough that I can get a handful of viscerals off while Logarius is charging some of his bigger attacks, or when he tries to place his sword into the ground. It doesn't always work, but it does cut a considerable amount of time off the final attempt. Honestly, I don't want to give anyone points for this. Logarius is such a pain that I'd rather make him take a big fat 0 for both builds. However, if I'm considering the pros and cons of the Tonitrus against the Rifle Spear, then there is actually a clear winner between the two builds, even if the fight itself was a nightmare twice in a row. This is going to be a point for Viking, since the Tonitrus' speed was able to take advantage of the few moments when Logarius was actually vulnerable to attacks. Alright, with Logarius finally down, Musashi can finally upgrade his weapon again, and this is when we get the true star of the show for a samurai build. That's right, we finally got a katana to call our own, the Chikage. Testing this out against the Shadows of Yharnam, this weapon is pretty fun, I'll be honest. This is actually the first time I've ever made a build for this weapon. I've wanted to in the past, but early Logarius is so fucking miserable that I've never wanted to have to actually kill him with a temp weapon in order to actually get it. Like I said, sometimes being a YouTuber is fun, because I'd clearly never have done this if it wasn't for a video. And now I might have a new runner-up for favorite weapon in Bloodborne. I also have the Evelyn now, and while it only loses a few shots here, it will start affecting fights soon. Considering how many fights were determined by it during the Ninjaverse Pirate match, this could bode ill for Ragnar. So obviously, Ragnar still hasn't passed using the Tonitrus, as there was no weapon back in Castle Cainhurst that would replace Mjolnir. We did get some new drip though. It's at least real armor, so that's kinda close to something a Viking would wear, but there's really nothing that fits properly for either of these guys at this point in the game. As for the Shadows of Yharnam, well, we die once, but that's expected considering how this gank fight works. Considering how easy it is to get caught by one of these three from off screen, that won't go too far against Ragnar come the scoring phase. Also, once we get all three of them separated, things go much smoother. As for the Tonitrus itself, it's really not especially great or terrible here. The Shadows don't seem to be particularly susceptible to bolt damage, and therefore the buffed or unbuffed attacks deal pretty minor hits, even though we're all the way up to +7 on the Tonitrus at this point. Now, I'll certainly admit that I do tend to bias the new weapons on their first outings after picking them up, but in this case, I don't think the Chikage needs the bias at all. Yeah, who would have guessed that once again, the katana is one of the best weapons in a FromSoftware game. That's a point to Samurai, and things are looking grim for the Viking for the remainder of the base game. I've been pretty torn on Rom for a while, because while its difficulty seems to mostly come from how much she spams the field with little spiders and magic projectiles, there is some strategy at play to actually killing her, and working around that spam can still be pretty fun. Way better than the next guy coming up at least. As for how the Chikage fares against her, it continues to be a powerhouse against the base game bosses. There's a reason it's locked behind Logarius, as it has the potential to dish out some phenomenal damage that breaks even the bosses deep into the late game. A truly exceptional weapon. Not gonna lie, that initial death really doesn't set the vibes in a great direction at this point. I mean, Ragnar basically went from Logarius to dying to the Shadows of Yharnam to dying to this spider spam bullshit. Really not a great showing for this build, even if it was my own greed that got me caught in the wombo combo there. On a return trip, the bolt-infused R2 is able to dispatch the little spiders in one hit each, which is better than I can say for a lot of builds I've brought this far into the last few runs. Likewise, once it's Rom and Ragnar alone in the first phase, he manages to push the fight directly into phase 3. After that, it's hit and run for the win, with spider and magic spam threatening to take me down at any moment. Discounting that initial death, the fight does start to get a little closer, as both weapons were clearly able to kill the baby spiders in one hit each, and once it turned into hit and runs, both weapons are fast enough to not leave me exposed for too long between hits. However, I have to give this one to the better moveset of the Chikage over the Tonitrus. While both are plenty quick, the katana has more varied attacks for different circumstances, which the Tonitrus simply does not keep. So that's a point to Samurai, continuing to show that FromSoftware will always emphasize katanas in all of its games. You know, people clown on FromSoftware's minimalist storytelling and the player character's complete lack of reasonable responses to the horrors in front of them, or any kind of motivation for getting into all of the fights they push themselves into. But like, I've never connected with the player character more than I do with the hunter right here. Because if I saw something like the One Reborn drop out of the sky and sploot onto the ground like that, I think the only thought I'd have in my head would be kill it too. Anyway, we kill the ladies, which take 2 hits per lady for the Chikage, and then we can head down for the main course. Terrible analogy. I don't want this thing anywhere near my mouth. The birthday boy, however, takes a little more doing, but the Chikage is plenty strong enough to break the boss's limbs and get us some damage directly on the main body, riding the rest of the stuff. That being said, this is kind of a bastard of a non-telegraphing fight, and even when we've got the main body down, he's usually still summoning goop from above our heads. So this does take a hot minute to get through, since so much of the time is spent dodging and recovering from barely readable attacks. Now, Ragnar might actually have an advantage here with the Tonitrus, considering that the kin-type enemies, like the One Reborn, tend to be weaker to bolt damage than they are to the blood damage of the Chikage. We can actually see this right away, as the Tonitrus can one-shot the ladies before we drop down into the main fight. Not making that mistake again. As for the rest of the boss himself, it actually behaves a bit more like the giant beast fights than most kin fights, with limb breaking for huge damage windows being the key to victory more often than not. The only problem being the wonky way that the boss actually attacks, causing some issues with actually getting those chances to break those limbs and deal the damage. In kind of a surprise upset at this point in the game, this one actually has to go to the Tonitrus. It should be noted that both of these weapons are at +9 right now, thanks to the plentiful bloodstone chunks found in Yargul. However, the bolt damage seems to be much better suited for this fight specifically. So yeah, that's a point for the Viking, given that the weapon choice takes better advantage of the boss's vulnerabilities. So Mikolash is RNG the fight, since Call Beyond can kill me instantly, and my chances of survival in the second phase are entirely based on how much he decides to cast it. RNG does cause some strange problems for Ragnar's bout against Mikolash, but we do get to use poison to kill him without worrying about the second phase. Now, there are a few reasons I'd give poison over as a viable tactic for a Viking. For one, the culture even has an entire word for it, adder, which is used both for poison and venom, and appears in text mostly as a tool for dangerous animals, but could have otherwise been utilized by warriors. This is also a great time to mention the tale of Sigurd Eystein, who died after being poisoned in battle with a rival Viking tribe. See, Sigurd the Mighty was a brutal and dangerous Jarl, having conquered many of the surrounding tribes during his time. However, what finally felled him wasn't a more powerful fighter or even a clever enemy. Instead, it was his own boastful brutality. As Sigurd defeated a man called Bridget, he beheaded the man and swung the loose head by the hair as a show of his victory. In his excitement, the man's teeth dug into Sigurd's side and pierced his skin. This led to an infection that would eventually lead to Sigurd's death. Does this really count as poison? I don't know, but it's a really fun Viking story that isn't purely from the Edda, and goes to show that maybe showboating isn't the best way to celebrate victory. Was this a flimsy excuse to use poison and tell a neat tale? Sure. Is this still going to be a point to Viking as a result? Absolutely. And now we've finally come to the end of the Any percent, fought all of the bosses on the main path, and can soon wake from this nightmare. Oh, right, there's still the cleanup and DLC to do. Awesome. Well, after that initial death, Mergo's wet nurse is otherwise a pretty easy fight, so it's fine. The initial swipe keeps getting me on some of these runs though. I'm pretty sure it happened back in both the pirate and ninja runs as well. Once the actual fight starts though, the Chikage does well enough to really chunk away at Mergo. even getting me a Rapid Poison Me during the transition into the Purple Mist phase. Rapid Poison doesn't come up much outside of PvP and Chalice dungeon builds, but it's a status effect that works a lot like Bleed in other FromSoft games, dealing a huge amount of damage all at once when it applies. Since the Chikage is one of few weapons that can innately deal this type of poison, it can really blast through any enemies that are vulnerable to it, which isn't many. This is honestly a very strange fight for Ragnar, as Mergo decides not to go into the Purple Shadow Realm for some reason. Actually, that some reason is most likely these stuns I get on her, as entering the Shadow Realm is an attack that has to hit us, not a flat phase transition. So it is possible to skip them if you know they're coming and can properly avoid the shots that activate the mist, either by dodging or staggering Mergo. The result is a surprisingly simple fight, where the boss mostly does some low-risk attacks that chop me up a bit, but it's nothing I can't handle. This is an odd one to judge, because on one hand, the Rapid Poison Me from the Chikage makes this fight go way faster for Musashi. However, the speed and stagger of the Tonitrus perfectly stunning Mergo out of even entering her second phase makes the fight much more manageable, even if the lower damage draws it out a little bit longer. It's a bit of a toss-up, and some worse RNG from either fight could have certainly made either's benefits fall short, but as it stands, this has to be a point for both, but for completely different reasons across both fights. Very interesting outcome there. Well, with Mergo dead, it's time to clean up the extra bosses before we can actually head into the ending. This means the optional fights we skipped during the main path throughout the game, as well as the DLC. We'll start out easy for now with Darkbeast Paarl, and by start out easy, I mean he might actually be dead by the time I finish this sentence, depending on how snappy I make the edit of kicking his ass. We're really late for this guy, to be honest. Ideally, we should be coming here sometime before ROM. I'm not gonna lie, I really expected the Tonitrus to do worse against Paarl since the bolt damage literally originates from this guy specifically, in the lore at least. But yeah, it does fine to rip him apart. Again, we are here extremely late and it certainly shows. While I could consider both of the builds overpowered for Paarl, I'd be lying if I said the Chikage didn't go way harder against this boss. That's the power of matching up bosses with their elemental weaknesses for you. Some weapons are simply better suited for some fights. So yeah, point to Samurai, even if both of these builds fuck this guy up at this point. Next up for the cleanup bosses is Amygdala. And boy, being able to shoot Amy in the face really trivializes massive parts of this fight, especially when we've got Bone Marrow Ash. I barely even need my Chikage to bring her down. In fact, it goes away for the visceral attack I do get, so I actually didn't need it. Without a ranged weapon, it's up to the Tonitrus's overhead swings to hit Amy in the face to give Ragnar an advantage. Unfortunately, while the uncharged R2 does swing vertically, the weapon's range doesn't make it the best option for this fight. It's still not difficult since we're coming here towards the end of the game, but we're still definitely not using an optimal build for this encounter specifically. I mean, is it even a question? The Evelyn basically won this fight for Musashi on its own, let alone if he'd actually needed to pull out the Chikage as a backup. Point to Samurai, and it honestly wasn't even close this time. Sorry, Ragnar. Now, we've got one final real boss before jumping into the DLC. But we've also got to pull some weeds before we can even get to that. Okay, Celestial Emissary, come take your lumps. Goodness, I'd honestly be embarrassed to die to this fight at this point. It's way too easy. Could have sworn this guy killed me in this run. Man, these fights are really starting to bleed together at this point, huh? Don't get me wrong, it gets shaky towards the end, but even stuck with the Tonitrus this whole time, I still take out the Emissary. Though, fun note for the start of the fight, if you're trying to figure out which one is the boss Emissary, look for whichever one doesn't immediately attack. Yeah, the boss is really shy in the first phase and spends most of its time walking away from the player. So, like all of my bullies in high school, go kick the introverted loser until he explodes. There is certainly something to be said about the different levels of aggression the whole group showed towards me across both of these fights. That could have easily caused major issues for Ragnar that didn't happen for Musashi. That being said, RNG was not the deciding factor here, it's the lackluster damage of the Tonitrus. It's been holding the Viking back for a while now, and even though the bolt damage and the weapon's overall speed has managed to come in clutch on occasion, it really isn't enough to carry the build over the Chikage. In that case, point for Samurai, for much better weapons, but also the effect that blood damage seems to have against kin-type enemies that even seems to go further for DPS than Bolt at times. It was really against Ebritus that I started to realize exactly how powerful the Samurai build is, since this is where it became obvious that kin enemies are rather susceptible to blood damage. In Musashi's case, not only is the Chikage super strong here, but the Evelyn gets some incredible shots off with Bone Marrow Ash, and gives us a stylish finish. Even if this takes 2 tries to get her down, this is one of the best builds I've taken in to fight Ebritus in a long time. Stellar damage, solid moveset, powerful ranged attacks, no notes. Musashi has been cleaning up in these last few fights. As a complete reversal of my wonderment as Musashi here, Ragnar really struggles against Ebritus. In fact, this was actually so frustratingly unwinnable on my first few attempts that I had to come back and do the fight again on a future recording day. Sometimes you gotta call it and go to bed on a loss, what can I say? After coming back, however, I immediately got it on the first try after giving it a good night's sleep and working on some other writing work for a bit. Lots of time and mental mileage to clear my head, so breaks can be good. Don't feel bad about going to bed on a loss, folks. The footage might not exactly speak for itself at this point, but my tone in narration certainly does. Regardless of numbers, or time, or damage, or whatever statistical metric I might want to apply to these to make them even vaguely objective, I gotta go with vibes. And Ragnar did not have the vibes. So, pretty easy point to Samurai, as we head into the DLC where I don't expect the vibes to improve anytime soon. Alright, as we jump into the DLC, we have something to pick up before we start the fights. Namely, we need to murder Simon in cold blood. Absolutely slice his entire body open and bathe in his entrails. Completely slaughter him and pilfer his corpse. Because we need Simon's bowblade. This is because of something I'll certainly mention in every single part of the series. Even though the current conception of the samurai nowadays in popular media is that of a dueling swordsman, samurai really are best described as mounted archers before anything else. The dedication to the katana really comes from the Edo period, as the way of the Yari and the Yumi dominated samurai warfare for most of Japan's history pre-Edo. This isn't even specifically a critique of Western interpretations of the samurai, but an observation of media from both America and Japan that tends to focus more on the flashier sword combat that plays better on screen and in drama. The same can be said for depictions of warfare in medieval Europe as well, as so much of our modern art tends to focus on knights in armor with swords rather than how many armies fought entirely with the bow across much of Europe and Asia. In that case, there's no better weapon for Musashi to take into the DLC. Then we get to Ludwig, who is really not made better by fighting with the bowblade, but at least I'm not fighting him too early like Logarius. Honestly, I've started to rescind my hatred for this guy the more I fight him after beating the rest of the base game. Who'd have guessed having an endgame build would improve an endgame fight? Ludwig is guarding Ragnar's weapon upgrade into the DLC, so we'll need to kill him to get our next upgrade. Right off the bat, we take a pretty frustrating death in an attempt that almost made it to the end. But a couple resets is all it takes for us to get the fight down. Certainly not the worst time I've had against this guy, but also not exactly the great last hurrah for the Tonitrus. More like a wet thud as we're still struggling to get through to the end of this fight. When we do finally get the win, it's anything but clean, but we make it all the same. So if we're going with personal preference, I'd probably have to consider Simon's bowblade a downgrade from what we had with the Chikage. But it's only a single notch down the ladder. Like, sure, I'd prefer the blood katana, but the bowblade is still plenty of fun to take into any fight. Definitely a top tier DLC weapon, and therefore it continues to beat on the Tonitrus. So this is a point to Samurai, as Bloodborne's best shot at the iconic Gimmie succeeds at rising above many base game weapons. This is where I actually started to feel the downgrade from the Chikage to the Bowblade. That blood damage should have gone hard here, and the time investment on firing an arrow leaves us pretty exposed when there are up to 4 failures out at a time. Still, it's not like we're really struggling right now. Less than perfect still isn't bad, and this is a super fun weapon to use. This is another first for me, and I'm very much enjoying the build right now. Now that Ragnar has finished off Ludwig, it's time to finally move on from the Tonitrus, which has been a Mjolnir stand-in, to another important weapon from Norse mythology, specifically one from the very end of the Poetic Edda, the Sword of Surtur. See, for as many interpretations as there have been for the sword that would be used by the giant Surtur, that would begin the massive explosion that will reset everything at the end of Ragnarok, lots of them tend to look at the mention of a giant glowing sword to be a giant sword that has either been lit on fire, or might be heated and pulled directly from the forge, or in some cases is entirely made of fire. However, there is room to interpret the Sword of Surtur to not mean to be involved with fire at all. Rather, there is an interpretation to say that the sword either simply glows with light or is made of that light. And so, that means we can use the Moonlight Greatsword as the stand-in for the Sword of Surtur, at least when it's in its light form. That will have ramifications down the line, by the way. But for now, I get to have a great time with my favorite weapon ever. Full stop, no caveats or additional context required. This is it, baby. So hopefully it doesn't suck against the living failures. So, turns out that swapping out my favorite weapon ever can absolutely lift the vibes, even in a fight that is resistant to its specific type of damage. Yeah, this is a point to Viking, and honestly, I'm willing to call it here over this mythological connection to use my favorite weapon. But that's not up to me, so we soldier on. There really was a part of me that wanted to swap out the Chikage for this fight. Wouldn't an epic clash between the Chikage and a Rakuyo have been so sick? Maybe in a different playthrough, but unfortunately not now. For now, we're testing the viability of the blade versus the bow. Which era of samurai is best? The pre-Edo mounted archer or the Edo period way of the sword duelist? Granted, Musashi of all people really shouldn't be the one trying to prove the bow superior. Which honestly, it's kind of cleaning up here, so it might be. As for Ragnar, Maria is usually pretty easy to blast down with the Moonlight Greatsword. The L2 especially really knocks her around for the first 2 phases. Honestly, that attack right there is probably the best thing about this weapon in Bloodborne. It absolutely eats up NPCs, and for most of this fight, that's exactly what Maria fights like. A slightly bigger and more impressive NPC. Love this fight, love this weapon. Happy Proc is having all the fun. Again, the Bowblade is a decently powerful weapon, and its moveset is fine, but it really doesn't stand up to the Moonlight Greatsword's L2 specifically. It does get more touch and go the further into the fight we get, with both weapons evening out a lot more towards the end, but being able to blast the first section down quickly really thumbs the scales. So yeah, another point to Viking, and it certainly has nothing to do with my bias towards my favorite weapon being in my hands. Well, as nice as the Bowblade has been up until now, we've swapped weapons again. We've grabbed the Rakuyo because while I'd previously used this as a stand-in for the Cutlass, the blade is really a katana, and its dual-wielding stance is clearly meant to be a katana and wakizashi combination. So, considering that this character's name is Musashi, the man who pioneered the dual katana style of combat, with an uchi katana in one hand and wakizashi in the other, I had no other choice but to take the Rakuyo into the final 2 fights of the DLC. This means that we'll be the Lord of the Dance as we get to Laurence. Regardless, the Rakuyo goes extremely hard on Laurence, and Samurai might honestly be back in the fight at this point. So, I'm not gonna lie, but Laurence is kind of a pill. And the Moonlight Greatsword, while my favorite weapon ever and visually at its best in Bloodborne, really isn't the best weapon in this game, especially when we're forced to use it specifically in the glowing state like this. It'll come up more in the next fight, but the weapon's shortcomings do start to show themselves right here. The biggest problem is that we're running into a massive lack of damage because of the way that it is being affected by being a split damage weapon, in Bloodborne at least, dealing both physical and arcane damage at the same time. This is why I say it's a problem in Bloodborne specifically, because in a lot of other games this damage is raw magic. And so we don't have to deal with the massive drop-off that split damage weapons get in this entire series for some fucking reason. The point is, this fight takes a couple of tries, and both attempts are wars of attrition, rather than the absolute massacre that they should be. Yeah, as much as I'd love to keep handing out wins to the Moonlight Greatsword, which, yes, by the way, I do know is called the Holy Moonlight Sword in this game, the Rakuyo simply ran away with it on this fight. Like, objectively the better weapon. Point to Samurai as the Rakuyo prepares to win the day for him from here on out. At this point, I'm pretty familiar with fighting Orphan of Kaz with the Rakuyo. It's honestly a fantastic choice for fighting him as well. It's quick, it's powerful, and both forms can sneak some hits in across both phases. Considering that this weapon is found right before the fight too, I'd almost say that this might be intended to be used against him. It's that good of a match for this fight. This is the kind of fight that makes me really love Orphan these days too. Even if I feel like I'm about to have a heart attack when I get to the end of it, this guy has slowly been working his way up to be my favorite in Bloodborne. He's still hanging around below Maria for me, but personal preference is exactly that. And at this point, having her at the top place for as long as she has been really means that she'll never likely be topped. So, Ragnar has a much worse time against Orphan, mostly because he is very resistant to our damage, which is to say that not only is he actually resistant to arcane damage, but he's now double resisting me here because of the split. This is really not a great weapon for this fight, I cannot lie. Worse still is the fact that the regular sword version of the weapon is actually better against Orphan, for both being faster and dealing specifically physical damage, which is much better against this boss. There's also the fact that the regular form can even get some good charge R2s out to knock Orphan to his knees for a visceral, while the glowing form can't deliver any viscerals at all as far as I can tell. Although, while this isn't a terrible weapon for even this fight, this is not the encounter where the Moonlight Greatsword shines the brightest, so to speak. It's kind of depressing to say, but yeah, the Rakuyo is simply the better option for these final fights, as it obviously chews up Orphan in ways that the Moonlight Greatsword could only dream. Point to Samurai, because apparently FromSoftware can't even make their signature weapon better than a katana in any of these games. Maybe we'll run this test again when we get another chance with a different version of the Moonlight Greatsword. Well, we don't get this in 1 with the Rakuyo, because honestly, what the fuck even is that sky attack? Yes, I know, run under him. That winds up working on future runs, but still. That is some insane damage for an invisible attack during the 3rd phase of a tanky as hell boss fight. Still, once we actually get into a round of this where I can properly get some hits in, the Rakuyo chews Gehrman up. He's by no means easy, and getting through the final phase is always one of the toughest parts of any of these runs, but it really can't be ignored exactly how powerful the Lord of the Dance truly is. Holy shit, I actually clicked the wrong option and had to reload an earlier save. Guys, I think this run straight up cooked a part of my brain. Like, no joke, what the fuck? Anyway, running it back, Gehrman continues to make this weapon feel incredibly weak, even though we've been at plus 10 and have dumped 30 levels into Arcane. One thing I will give the Moonlight Greatsword here, though, is the fact that the L2 continues to knock Gehrman to the ground in the first 2 phases. Once he gets his hyper poise armor in the final phase, though, it's anyone's game. It's a long slog to get those last few hits in, and I mean it. The final hit takes me almost a full minute to actually land. As much as it pains me to say it, this fight went so much better with the Rakuyo that there's really no room to defend what I'd otherwise want to call my favorite weapon. Another point to Samurai, since he started really emulating Musashi in full. Even the Sword of Surtur can't bring him down. The man is mightier than all of Asgard, it would seem. The Rakuyo fucks up Moon Presence. Honestly, everything fucks up moon presence. Yeah, we're giving this a point for both, since they each slap this man, or woman, or eldritch nightmare beyond the confines of gender nondescript genitalia in. And it is final score time. I've got to say, this was a bit of a closer match than I might have initially expected for these two, especially when either one started to run away with the points at different times in the competition. However, our final total comes out with the Viking trailing behind with only 10 points, in comparison to the Samurai's 14 points. I'll be honest, if Musashi had stuck with the Bowblade all the way through the DLC, then this might have been Ragnar's game. But the Rakuyo matched with the Samurai's namesake too well not to rep it here. As for the point totals of the series so far, the Samurai has kept and extended his lead with a massive 32 points as opposed to the Vikings' 21, an astounding 11-point lead from Musashi. It's going to be difficult as these two head into the next game for the Viking to catch up, but we're only 2 games deep into this competition and there are still 4 more chances for Ragnar to come out on top. And we haven't even started to see the depths of the Viking arsenal that can be found around FromSoftware's game worlds. Hey, it's that time again. The end of the video where I invite folks to come check out the Patreon. Link in the description, and make good on the rewards for those currently pledged. Patreon members get early access to new content and their names written in the credits at the end of videos. And those who pledge in the top tiers get their names read out, like our DevBox designers, Genghis Braun, and our DevBox developers, Azul. Thanks for your support, and thanks for watching.
Oh, good hunter.